So without further ado, it's my great pleasure to introduce to you WorkSystem's own resident labor market economist, Dr. Liza Moorhead. Liza holds a doctorate in urban studies with an emphasis on public policy and urban planning. And as the data and research analyst at WorkSystem, she is responsible for institutional research, data reporting, as well as labor market, demographic, economic, and policy research. Liza, it's all yours.
Do we have the workers we need to support a thriving regional economy? Are people able to get the education and the support they need to enter and to ultimately thrive in the labor force? And are we training people for the jobs that will be available to them tomorrow, or for the jobs that we needed in the past? In the years since the 2018 State of the Workforce Report was published, we have witnessed a dramatic recession brought on by a global pandemic. We've seen an equally dramatic rebound in jobs. We've witnessed the rapid acceleration of trends that are shaping and reshaping where and how we work, live, and shop. And many of us have reassessed the role that work plays in our own lives. In this report and today's presentation, we look at the regional labor force. How has it changed and responded to shifting economic and social landscape? And where do we go from here? The COVID-19 recession ended more than 2 years ago. And although we are long into recovery, economic and social trends caused by, or in many cases accelerated by, the pandemic have reshaped our economy in many ways. For example, automation and artificial intelligence, they've been around. They were a big part of what we talked about when we talked about the labor force before the pandemic, but the pandemic and the recession have really accelerated their use. Today I'm going to be talking about the labor force. What does today's labor force look like? How are trends and public policies around immigration shaping the labor force? What about a declining birth rate and an accelerating rate of retirement? And how are support services like the availability, or in many cases the lack of availability of childcare, impacting who has the opportunity to participate in the labor force? The pandemic interrupted education for tens of thousands of students. Understaffed schools are struggling to make up for learning loss and supporting a student body experiencing really high levels of mental and emotional distress. Teachers, home health care aides, registered nurses, they were already in short supply before the pandemic, but just as some of the schools in our region that trained those workers were closing, the pandemic really accelerated our need and created a crisis of the absence of those workers in our economy. That being said, this is also a time of great opportunity. A tight labor market means greater opportunity for workers. After declining for decades, we're seeing rates of unionization increase as workers are demanding a stronger voice and higher wages. Working remotely means fewer commutes, and that leaves more time for individuals, for their families, and their community. Workers are changing jobs, starting new careers, and opening their own businesses. This report and today's event is, as Abe mentioned, a product of the Columbia Willamette Workforce Partnership, which is a partnership of 3 workforce boards: Workforce Southwest Washington, the Clackamas Workforce Partnership, and WorkSystems, the Workforce Board of Multnomah and Washington counties. The COVID-19 pandemic was swifter and more severe than the Great Recession. In just 1 month, we lost more jobs in this region than it took to lose in 2 years during the Great Recession. Now, the recovery was also swifter. And today, as a region, we've regained nearly all of the jobs that we lost since 2020. Full recovery, though, isn't just about regaining lost jobs. Prior to the pandemic, our year-over-year job growth rate was above 2%. And so to have a full recovery, we would need to not only regain those lost jobs, but recapture that growth. So today, we're back on track, but we're not back to where we were before the recession. Between 2019 and 2022, job growth and job loss were not evenly spread across the economy. Since 2019, we have nearly 25,000 fewer accommodation and food service workers in our region. That's 7,000 fewer wait staff, more than 4,000 fewer fast food and counter workers. And those jobs aren't coming back. They have been replaced by touchscreens and in-app ordering systems. Where we're seeing opportunity is in the industries that have grown in terms of jobs during that period. Professional and technical services, healthcare and social assistance, transportation and warehousing. These are all industries that have increased their share of the region's employment. We are nearly back to where we were in February 2020 when it comes to the unemployment rate. Thinking back to that period, before everything that we talked about was COVID, what we were talking about was how to take advantage of a labor market where we had a 3% unemployment rate. We're not quite back there, but we're getting close. And that means that today, almost everyone in our region who wants a job can get one. At the Collaborative, we use the self-sufficiency wage to measure the amount that a family needs to earn to make ends meet. Because even though jobs are available to most people who want them, that doesn't mean that families and individuals in our region are able to support themselves. The self-sufficiency wage is an improvement on the federal poverty level because it includes things like housing, the real cost of food, the cost of childcare, which is a huge one, and it looks at families and individuals in a given place. So we know that costs vary by different counties, and it also looks at the people in a family. A family of 4 that includes 2 adults and 2 teenagers has different expenses than a family of 4 that includes 1 adult, 1 school-aged child, and 2 infants. So we use the self-sufficiency wage to get a sense of whether the jobs available to people in our region pay enough. And the news isn't looking great. When we look at 8 out of the 10 largest jobs in our region by number of workers, only 8 of them pay enough for many common family types to make their ends meet without public assistance in the form of TANF or SNAP benefits or private assistance in the form of free babysitting from a relative or food from a soup kitchen. And we know that that is felt much worse in female-headed households. Female-headed households with children are the most likely to be below the poverty level of any household type. And that is even more true when the woman heading that family is a woman of color. Even though we're closing the gap, today women in our region only earn about 81% of what their male counterparts earn. So who are these workers? What does our labor force look like today? Who's participating, and how are public policies and personal decisions playing into that? Today, there are nearly 1.4 million people in our regional labor force, and that makes it the largest that it has ever been at any point in history. And we know that the vast majority of those people, more than 96%, are currently working. And that makes sense because for more than the past 10 years, our labor force has been growing, and it has been growing in nearly every county across our region. So between 2011 and 2021, our labor force increased by more than 16%. All right, so I just told you that our labor force is the largest it's ever been, and that it's been growing pretty rapidly. So why then are there so many employers who are having trouble finding the workers that they need? The first thing about that is that even though our labor force is the largest it's ever been, our labor force participation rate is not. So the labor force participation rate, as I'm sure you know, is the percentage of people of working age who are able to work, who are choosing to work or to actively look for work. Starting in about 2001, the labor force participation rate in Oregon started to drop. There was a big drop during the Great Recession, and during the COVID recession, there was a pretty dramatic decline, but the rebound was swift. And today, we have a higher labor force participation rate than we have at any point since the Great Recession. Now, are there people who could work who are opting not to work? Of course, there are always people who don't participate in the labor market for any number of reasons. But our labor force participation rate is not shockingly low, and in fact, it's rebounded pretty significantly from where it was at any time since the Great Recession. And in our region, it's even higher than this statewide rate. And that's true for all different age groups. It's true for youth who are early in their career. It's true for people who are just starting out and finishing school, people in their mid-career, and even people nearing the end of their careers. So one of the things that we have seen nationally and locally that's impacting our labor force is immigration. Nationally, immigration has been declining since 2016, and it took a big hit during COVID. Part of that had to do with the disease itself, and part of it had to do with federal policies designed to limit immigration. Since about 2004, more than half of growth in our labor force nationally has been the result of immigration. Immigrants are more likely to participate in the labor force than non-immigrants. And this big decline in immigration is really bringing down the labor force participation rate. We see that across the board with H-1B visas for highly skilled immigrants and for other type of workers as well. We're also seeing a lower birth rate, which translates into fewer workers. In the late 1990s, the birth rate dropped pretty significantly, and that has meant fewer people in that generation who are entering the labor force today. You can see the red line on the chart. That shows the difference between the folks who are in their mid to late 20s and the folks in their early to mid 20s. And the difference between those two age groups in our region is about 20%. So there are significantly fewer people in these younger age groups coming up than in the larger or the older generations. And then if we look at those top two bars under the red line, those are youth. So we already have a smaller population, and then those folks who are about 15 to 24, that's a group that consistently has a lower labor force participation rate because they are finishing high school. Maybe they're going to college, or they are doing some training. And this particular generation of youth has been really severely impacted with educational opportunities and with mental health during the pandemic. So we have fewer workers coming in. And while we have fewer workers entering the labor force, we're also seeing an acceleration of older workers leaving the labor force. So what we normally see during a recession is people holding off on retirement. Economic uncertainty makes people a lot less willing to quit their job and give up their career. Maybe their 401k took a hit. Maybe they're just not sure that they're going to be able to support themselves. So the COVID recession was different because the COVID recession was caused by a highly contagious, deadly disease, and it really accelerated retirement. People at retirement age, even people a little bit below retirement age, exited pretty quickly if they were able. So by 2021, we saw that half of older adults in the United States were retired. And initially, there was some thought, will people come back into the labor force? A vaccine was developed and made widely available, and made available first to this group, and jobs came back. A lot of people exited quickly. Maybe they didn't finish everything they wanted to do. Maybe retirement wasn't what they'd planned for, but they didn't. There was question, would we see folks coming back? And we really haven't. This chart shows the labor force participation rate for adults 65 and older who don't have a disability. There was a big drop after growing pretty steadily for a couple of decades. There was a big drop during 2020. And while there's been a little bit of an increase, it really hasn't recovered. And every year that goes by, the chance that these folks are coming back just gets smaller and smaller. And today, when we look at, in our region, the share of workers who are 55 and older, so nearing retirement age, that group is growing proportionally compared to the rest of people in our labor force. So we have, I think, 24% of workers, and especially in some of our critical sectors, are nearing retirement age. Labor force participation rate by sex. There has long been a big difference between the labor force participation rate for men and women in our country. COVID impacted that. I'm sure a lot of people in this room can remember the month during COVID when 1 million women nationally left the labor force. Some of those women have come back, but some of them haven't. And a big part of that has to do with childcare. Our region was already a childcare desert prior to COVID. There were not enough spaces available to families, and those spaces were expensive. And COVID has just made that worse. And when we talk about childcare, we're not just talking about infant care and preschool. We're talking about before care and after care for elementary school and middle school students. We're talking about no school day camps and summer camps. In October and November alone, Portland Public School has 8 days where there is no school, and only 2 of those days are federal holidays. Friday, there is no school in Portland Public Schools. There are a lot of days where there is not childcare being provided by the school system. Ask me how I know. So, education. What does it look like? How are we doing? Are we training folks who live here for the jobs that we need workers for? And are we attracting educated folks from other places? The good news is that our high school graduation rates are getting better. In the past few years, we have seen an increase in the percentage of male students, the percentage of Black students, of white students, of Hispanic students who are graduating high school in 4 years. Female students already doing great, still doing well. And we have also seen the achievement gap between Hispanic and white students close in terms of high school graduation. Now, we still do see a persistent, although shrinking, but still persistent achievement gap where Black students are not graduating high school in our region in 4 years at the same rate as other students. Looking to the future, are these improved high school graduation rates gonna stick around? That's a big question. This chart shows educational attainment for the Oregon portion of the region, 11th grade test results. And this is from this past school year, and the year before. They don't look good. Level 3 and level 4. Level 3 are students who are at grade level. Level 4 is students who are above grade level. And for math, for English, for science, all of those, less than 50%. Math, about 25% of 11th grade students are on track and completing work at grade level. This just shows the Oregon portion, but it looks pretty similar in the Washington portion. Learning loss, the impact of distance schooling, all of the inconsistencies and shutdowns in schools resulting from the teacher shortage, resulting from COVID, has really, really impacted students. And it's unclear whether we will be able to make up for that and get kids back on track. The other chart shows a comparison of the 2014-2015 school year with the 21-20 school year. And even though, honestly, our 11th grade test results were not great in 2014-2015, they've taken a big hit. And that leads into Opportunity Youth. Opportunity Youth are a really important untapped resource in our region. Opportunity Youth are defined as folks who are 16 to 24 who are not currently in school or working. Some of these folks have graduated from high school, some of them haven't, some of them have work experience, some of them don't. But right now, there are nearly 35,000 youth in our region who aren't working or in school. And that is despite an increase in youth hiring over the last 10 years. And so not only is this a crisis for individuals and their families, but right now in this tight labor market, that's a lot of people. And this situation is complicated by the fact that the industries that have classically provided that first foothold or that first step into the economy for many of these youth, those were some of the industries that were most impacted during the pandemic. Accommodations and food services, arts, entertainment and recreation, retail, together they lost about 30,000 jobs in our region. And so if those jobs aren't going to be available to youth to get that foothold in the labor market, we need to come up with another plan. So now I want to talk about adult educational attainment. And so this is looking at adults 25 years and older and whether they have a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree. And so for the past 20 years or so, this has really been a high point in our region. In 2016, about 38% of adults in our region had a bachelor's degree or an advanced degree. And that's a really important driver of economic opportunity. We need people who are a diversity of people educated at all different levels in order to attract and retain businesses. So that's what we were seeing in 2016, but it's starting not to drop, but to grow less. So when we had 40% of adults in our region with a bachelor's or an advanced degree, nationally that rate was about 33%. So we were doing well, but there's a lot of concern right now that we're not going to continue to do well. And there are two reasons for that. The first is the interrupted educational pipeline. So when we look at educational attainment of adults, we're looking at how well are we doing educating youth and young adults in our region, and then how well are we doing in attracting educated people from outside of the region. During the pandemic, we saw a big decrease in the number of local folks enrolling in colleges and universities. The most dramatic was Clackamas Community College, where we saw a nearly 30% decline between fall 2019 and fall 2020. But it happened across the board. And I mean, it makes sense, right? Because school was shifting online. Not everybody is interested or able or has the technology to do that. We also saw a lot of increased caregiving responsibilities for students. A lot of economic uncertainty means people were saying, I'm not sure that this job is going to be available to me in the way I want it in the future. Maybe I'll hold off. And at the same time, we were involved in a national conversation about student debt. And people entering school were seeing, in many cases, how crippling that was for people 5, 10, 15 years older than them. So today, we've seen some stabilization in enrollment in our regional colleges and universities, but we're not back to where we were before. And even when we get there, there's going to be this interruption in the pipeline that continues to go through. The people who would have registered in 2020, maybe finished their associate's degree by now, be on track for their bachelor's degree, a lot of them didn't. The other way that we increase our adult educational attainment is by attracting educated migrants. And that is where we have really thrived as a region for the past 20 years or so. We have seen large numbers of educated adults, folks right out of college, moving here for economic opportunity, for cultural opportunities, and that has really hidden the lower levels of educational attainment of people growing up here. So this is showing the comparison between in-migrants from other areas and our local population in terms of educational attainment. And the rates for bachelor's degree, graduate or professional degree are much, much higher when we look at migrants. And within migrants themselves, the vast majority of them have at least some college or an associate's degree, if not that bachelor's degree or advanced degree. So that's where we were until about 2020. And then the pandemic hits and we see some changes. You were all here, you all lived through it. We know that people were making different choices during the pandemic and really reassessing where to live in relation to family, to communities. And what we started to see was a decrease in educated in-migration and an increase in educated out-migration. So we had fewer educated young adults moving in and more educated young adults leaving. A big part of this has to do with how expensive it is to live in our region. For a long time, Portland had a pretty positive cost of living compared to other West Coast cities. But that's really going away. Between December 2019 and December 2022, the cost of all residential housing that was for sale increased by 27%. And sure, today we're seeing that go down a little bit, but that's because interest rates are so high that it's really limiting people's ability to sell their house if they want to buy a new house. And we're also seeing big increases in the cost of rental housing. Now that I have everyone sad and worried, I'm going to talk about opportunity because there also is a lot of opportunity right now. Union representation increased 23% between 2017 and 2021. Today, more workers are taking advantage of union membership to negotiate for higher wages, better benefits, and a voice in workplace policy. We are seeing movement in critical support for workers And we're seeing workers really be able to move up and demand things from their jobs that they could not in the past. Oregon and Washington both have predictive scheduling laws. It wasn't so long ago that if you worked in food service or in retail, you might have to call into your job every day and say, do you need me to work? What time do you need me to come in? And then you would have to scramble to put together all of the things that allowed you to do that. Today, workers have to get 2 weeks out a written schedule. We've seen Multnomah County start to take steps to implement preschool for all, which once it is fully implemented, will provide childcare without a cost aside from taxes to many families, and that will enable a lot of people to enter the workforce if it comes to fruition. So alone, these efforts aren't going to close the gap, but they are indications of a wider understanding that we all need to participate in lowering barriers to labor force participation, and that employers need to be held to account when it comes to labor practices. One of the things that I know many people in this room are concerned about, many people in general are concerned about, is finding workers. The data on this slide, unfortunately, it's just for the Oregon portion of the region. It comes from a report put out by the Oregon Employment Department, but it's similar throughout the region. So this is looking at jobs that are persistently hard to fill. And one of the things that most of these jobs have in common is that they pay $25 or less per hour. And in our region, that's not a ton of money. And so while this isn't good news for the employers who are trying to fill these jobs, it is good news for the workers who have more opportunity and are able to negotiate for higher wages or to find a job that pays more to support themselves, their families, their pets. We are looking into the future. We anticipate positive job growth, and that is across multiple sectors of our economy. Looking at some of the jobs that we know are in high demand now and are going to continue to be in high demand, we're anticipating positive growth in some really good jobs. Looking at registered nurses, software developers, electricians, all of these are jobs that pay a high wage and have a lot of opportunity for career change and advancement. There are also jobs that require quite a bit of training. Nurses and software developers need a bachelor's degree. Electricians need to go through an apprenticeship. But we know that these jobs are going to continue to grow and be in demand. And if we don't fill them with local talent, people are going to come from outside our region and take those jobs, or those jobs are going to disappear because we're going to lose out on the industries that provide them. So right now is a great time to assess how can we bulk up and improve opportunities for apprenticeships, for nursing and software education. Right now, we're also seeing strong opportunities for a more inclusive economy. Some of the jobs that are the most in demand right now are mental health peer support specialists, substance abuse peer support specialists, residential advocates. And these jobs aren't necessarily the best paying jobs, but what they do have is opportunity, and in many cases, a requirement for people to have the type of lived experience that in other times can make it really hard to get into or back into the labor force. A tight labor market means opportunity for workers with barriers to employment. Sometimes that is prior criminal justice involvement. Sometimes it is a history of homelessness or substance abuse problems. We're talking about people who are English language learners and veterans. A tight labor market increases opportunity for all of these workers. employers who are competing for workers, there's also opportunity for them. Employers who are competing for workers can benefit from assessing the jobs that they offer to identify areas for improvement. Now, the obvious one is wages, but of course not every employer can pay the highest wages or can pay high wages at all. And that is part of the reason why the Collaborative has developed this quality jobs framework that identifies areas that are really important to people when they are looking at entering or participating in the labor market, and provides a playbook for employers to look at the jobs that they offer, see where they can become more competitive and compete for some of those workers. Because we know that wages are important, but right now, and especially after the last 3 years, we know a lot of other things are really important to workers. The ability to work from home if that's possible, to have predictive scheduling, to be able to look ahead and see opportunities for training and advancement in their careers. So this is something that we are launching now, and you'll be hearing a lot more about in the future. I know that you want me to stay here and talk all day about this, which I could do, but I won't. So how do you learn more about the state of the workforce? The report, the 2022-2023 report has just been finalized. It is available on the websites of all 3 workforce boards, which you can reach from the QR codes on your website. And we will also be delivering it to your inbox later this week. If you have questions, if you would like more information or a custom presentation for your geography, for your industry, get in touch with me. I am happy to do that.